Hi, welcome to Stratagames. I'm Jason, and today I'm going to be bringing you a deck tech. Now, this is a deck that I put together just a couple of weeks ago because I had one issue with my deck building. I like synergy and optimism to a degree too much. Most of my decks I try to make as synergistic as possible. I thrive on building an engine in a commander game. That's one of my favorite things. And because of that, I'm not that big of a fan of building like janky tribal decks or, you know, just slow kind of weird 7-card combo decks or anything like that. One of my friends just built a reality chip jellyfish tribal deck. Seems sweet, just not really my style. My problem is that I don't really have a deck quite at the power level of like a janky tribal deck or something that really fits the power level that some of the people are going for at FNM or in my friend group. I just want to make a deck that has that same level of synergy I enjoy without being too overly powerful. And that is why I decided to build Kotose. Now, when I saw Kotose, just like a lot of people, I thought that this was not a card built for Commander. I mean, it clearly says you exile a card from an opponent's graveyard, and then you get to search that player's graveyard, hand, and library for copies of that card and exile all of them. Generally, any card that searches for copies of a card isn't going to be good in Commander because unless you're playing like a Rat Colony or Persistent Petitioner deck, you're not going to have copies of a card in your deck because it's singleton. However, if you just ignore that whole portion and just realize you get to exile a card from an opponent's graveyard and then cast that card later, that's actually not half bad. It's kind of like a Gonti, which is another commander that I've actually thought about building for a long time. The reason I never did is because I feel like mono black is too restrictive for this type of deck, and because you're stealing cards directly from an opponent's library, there's not really a great way to work on that synergistically in the way I like, unless if you're, stacking your opponent's deck in some way, which is pretty hard in mono black. So when Kotose came out, I realized that this was the perfect time to make this deck. I could play Kotose and tons of other cards that can steal my opponent's cards, but specifically from their graveyard or their library. Now, I wanted to do it this way because I want this to be a fun deck. I don't want to be playing a deck where I steal all of their permanents or rip all the cards from their hand, because those generally aren't the most fun decks to play against. But if I'm taking cards from their library that they haven't seen yet, or cards from their graveyard that they've already used, I'm not really giving them card disadvantage, I'm just taking the cards after or before they've used them so that I can use them too. Now, I will say that there are a couple of cards in here that will take cards from my opponent's hand or battlefield, but only a very small number, and I feel like they really fit the theme well, and they're generally overpriced, so it's not like I'm going to be mind controlling their things every turn. That being said, let's first take a look at all the cards that can steal cards. First, we have a suite of cards that need to deal damage in order to steal cards from my opponents. Thief of Sanity, Nightveil Spectre, Zareth San, Fiend of the Shadows, and Fallen Shinobi. Now, Fiend of the Shadows is one of those ones that steals cards from my opponent's hand, but it's also a pretty bad card and probably not going to stay in this deck super long, so, it's probably fine. It's a little over costed. All of these other ones, though, are really sweet. You just hit your opponent, and then you get to take something from their graveyard, top 2 off their library, 1 of 3 off their library, or just the top card of their library. So these are just really cool ways that I can start taking the cards from their library and be able to cast them for free, or just put them straight onto the battlefield. Rogue class fits in that, not being a creature itself, but allowing all of your other creatures to take cards when you hit them, and also granting them evasion. Hostage Taker is that mean card that does steal cards directly from my opponent's board. Yes, it's a little mean. I think it's the only one in this deck, but it fits so well with the theme, and I have a soft spot for this card, I'm sorry. Mind Leecher steals a card from each of my opponents when it mutates. It is the only mutate card in here, but it also grants flying and makes my creatures really big, which can help them deal damage if they need to do that. Kara's Spell Snatcher is one of a few more for manifest cards in this deck, and it works just perfectly. It's a pretty overcosted counterspell, but it allows me to cast the spell that I counter for free later on. Sudden Substitution, I don't know if this card is good, but it's just kind of janky and kind of fits the theme of swapping control and stuff like that, so, we'll give it a try. Siphon Insight directly steals a card from my opponent's library, plus it has flashback. Connive Concoct can either steal a card from my opponent's board, apparently that's 2 in here, or it can surveil to return a card from my graveyard to the battlefield, which is the more likely option. Garuda is super sweet in here, especially because we do have a couple of clones. Not too many. We have a Phantasmal Image, a Clever Impersonator, and then also a Rite of Replication. I'll probably try to get a Spark Double for this deck, but don't have one yet. But then again, I also want to be able to copy my opponent's things because, you know, we're doing a little bit of that. This is not a clone tribal deck. I have just these 3 here. I don't have a million. Well, I guess I have 4 if you count Lazav, who does copy an opponent's creature that was put into their graveyard from anywhere. So, you know, I got a couple, but nothing crazy. I don't have a problem. Mnemonic Betrayal is one that I haven't gotten to play yet, but seems sweet. You basically get to take all cards from your opponent's graveyards for a single turn and try to cast as many as you can. Kind of like a Past in Flames for your opponent's graveyards, and seems super sweet. And then we have a bunch of high drops. Thieving Amalgam allows you to steal cards from your opponent's library each turn, manifesting them, making a whole bunch of 2/2s. Lorcan steals creatures that are dying or just going to the graveyard by paying life equal to their mana cost. And then Sphinx Ambassador is just a super fun card that I've had for quite a while, and it allows you to play a little bit of a mini game with your opponent. You deal damage to them and you get to search their library for a creature card, and then they have to guess what that card is, and if they can't, you get it onto the battlefield. So those are all really cool ones too. Of course, Gonti, Lord of Luxury. And then we have a couple cards that steal directly from your opponent's graveyard. Puppeteer Click and Sepulchral Primordial are great for this. A Mimic Vat can take anything that has died and just get a copy of it over and over. Most of the cards we've been stealing have been permanents in some way, but we also have Diluvian Primordial, Spell Twine, and Chaos Wand, all allowing us to steal instants and sorceries from our opponents as well. And because we have a lot of these evasive threats already, we also have a Satoru Umezawa. Apparently, LGSs aren't allowed to sell these because they're box toppers, and so my LGS was kind enough to just give me one, so that was really sweet of them. And because of Umezawa, as well as that Fallen Shinobi that we have, we want a couple more elusive threats. We have Achata the Silencer, which is just a great removal spell, and also can be a great ninjutsu target. Dimir Infiltrator, which acts as a tutor for ramp, removal, pretty much anything. I'm usually not that big on tutors, but a Transmute is totally different in my opinion because it's so specific that I think it's okay. And then we also have this Shadow Mage Infiltrator, which is, gonna be honest, a pretty bad card in this deck. It's gonna be taken out pretty soon when I have some other cards to replace it with, but it works just fine right now. And because we have a bunch of creatures that need to attack to get their abilities, of course, we have a Swiftfoot Boots. We do have a couple draw spells, Preordain, Ghostly Pilfer, Dig Through Time, Slither Muse, Moldrifter, just because we want a little bit of card draw. Generally, I'd have about twice as many cards as this, but a lot of our card draw are those cards that steal directly from our opponents, so we actually don't need that much. Preordain lets us set up the top of our deck in case that's relevant. Slither Muse is just a really fun card. Ghostly Pilfer is great in Commander, and then also, you know, those two are pretty good too. For staple categories like removal that you of course need, I try to use as few actual staples as possible and use more cards that are synergistic with the deck. I do have a Counterspell and a Rapid Hybridization. Those are just plain good, but most of the other ones are supposed to synergize with the deck more or just plain be more interesting. Things like Commit is great when I then steal the top 2 cards of my opponent's library because I can get any card from their board. Amphin Mutineer is a removal spell that kind of flashes back as another 3 removal spells later. It gives your opponent some 4/3s, which is, you know, not irrelevant, but, you know, this is just a pretty cool card. And I do have a Ghostly Flicker in the deck because I've got a bunch of ETBs, especially with Kotose and other things, that helps that Amphin Mutineer really take out a lot of my opponent's creatures. And one of my favorite new removal spells, I think this card is underplayed and just super fun, but also super good, Mystic Reflection. This can make any creature that's about to enter the battlefield another creature that's on the field. So quite often I've used this as an opponent casts a commander to do insane damage, sometimes even win. Somebody was playing a Godo, basically EDH deck, and I cast this against them to turn their Godo, before it even entered, into a 1/1 squirrel. Then it was a squirrel forever, until it died later. And this is just a super fun card. It can also be used offensively. In my Brago deck, I used it so that when I flickered all of my cards with Brago, every single creature would re-enter as a copy of 1 creature. So if I flicker, you know, 10 creatures, and then they all re-enter as that Sun Titan or whatever it is that I target. I'm not really sure why I put quite so much ramp in this deck. I usually put like 9, maybe 10 in my most aggressive decks, but I put 11. Now that's a little unusual seeing as this is supposed to be my more casual deck, so I'm not really sure why I did it, but there were 2 things I was trying to do with my ramp in this deck. One thing I wanted to do with my mana rocks is make mana of any color, not just the colors in my commander's color identity. One reason for that is I have a few cards like Nightveil Spectre that don't actually have that clause where you can spend the mana to cast that spell you stole for any color of mana. This was before they started doing that. So I need some way to get that color of mana when I take cards with Nightveil Spectre. The other reason is just if I take a card for any reason with any of my spells or abilities or anything, then I want to be able to activate abilities on those cards, even though I'm not technically playing white or green or red. That influenced my mana rock choice. For example, I'm using Felwar Stone, which produces colors my opponents can, Prismatic Lens, which in a pinch can just produce a mana of any color instead of just a colorless. And then I also have this really cool card that I don't think a lot of people know about, Manascape Refractor. It enters the battlefield tapped. Yes, it's a 3-mana mana rock, so no, it's not the most insane card ever, but it has all activated abilities of all lands on the battlefield. Now that includes, obviously, mana abilities, so if my opponent has a mountain, this can tap for red, but it also includes Rogue's Passage, or Witch's Clinic, or any other land ability that you can think of. This card is very good and very fun, just tons of fun in general. Now, I still do need to get a couple cards for this deck. I need a Chromatic Lantern and a couple other things, and I do certainly have an Arcane Signet and a Commander Sphere, which only produce colors of my commander's color identity, and I have a couple colorless ones as well. So, like, I'm still working on the mana base for this for sure, but it's something that is good to keep in mind if you're building a deck like this. Same with my lands. I actually do have a couple lands, Rupture Spire and Vivid Creek, that can produce mana of any color. These are both generally cards that I think are bad and wouldn't play in any deck, but this is supposed to be a more casual deck, and I want to be able to get mana of any color. I'll actually probably end up adding another 2 or 3 tap lands, like the other Vivid, or maybe other Rupture Spire variants, and stuff like that, just so I can play the cards that I steal, use the abilities of the cards I steal, but also it slows the deck down a little bit. Another thing that I did in this deck with the Mana Rocks that I don't usually do is I played 3 Mana Rocks. I am one of those people who generally likes more optimization, so I play a lot of 2 mana rocks and ramp spells. I do throw a Cultivate in every once in a while, but I generally don't play a Commander Sphere in my decks. But this is a slower deck. It's supposed to not be the most powerful ever. So I actually have Commander Sphere, I have Manascape Refractor as 3s, and I actually have a Hedron Archive and a Solemn Simulacrum at 4. Now, those might come out, these might come out. I'll probably redo this a little bit. Again, I've only had this deck together for a couple weeks, so it's not by any means complete, but I just wanted to show you what I've built and what I've been really enjoying. This deck is super fun, and the reason I've been enjoying it and the reason I felt like it was going to be great for making a lower power level deck is my game plan is primarily using cards from my opponent's decks. So if all of my opponents bring janky tribal decks, well, those are the types of cards I'm going to be stealing. And if they bring CEDH decks, this deck's going to lose to that for sure. But I can steal their win conditions, you know, no Underworld Breach or Thassa's Oracle for you, so that's maybe cool if I'm lucky. This deck has already shown that it can kind of adapt to whatever decks I'm playing against because I'm using my opponent's cards against them. The other day I was able to turn a Phantasmal Image into a copy of a Hullbreaker Horde that my opponents had, and that was super powerful for me. But if the best creature on the battlefield was like a Solemn Simulacrum, then that's all I could make a copy of. So this deck really levels against what you're playing against, I think, and it's just super fun along the way. You're getting to play your opponent's decks in kind of a steely type way, but not in a way that your opponents are denied all of their resources and they're going to hate you for it. In addition, Kotose only has 39 decks on the EDH rec, but I think Kotose is a really interesting commander, and because of that line about stealing copies of a card from an opponent's library, graveyard, and hand, a lot of people are likely to stay away from it because they don't realize that that's not what the deck is about. Kotose has been really fun already. I'm glad that I decided to just take the plunge and try to build this deck because it seemed cool, and I'm glad that some of these kind of underwhelming commanders can actually be really, really fun. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to show that in any way you want. Leave a comment, a like, write a song, start a podcast, sing it from the rooftops. It doesn't really matter to me. Also, in case you happen to be someone who cares, the reason we haven't been making as many videos recently is that I've been extremely busy trying to buy a house. That's been extremely stressful and time consuming, so I haven't had as much time to put out videos, and the videos we have put out haven't been as edited. That's why this video was kind of just me walking through the deck physically, which I don't usually do as much as actually editing the whole thing. I just don't really have the time on hand for that. But let me know if you like this style of video anyway, even though it's not as highly produced. Don't worry, in the next month or two, we should be back to getting regular videos, 1 to 2 a week, and hopefully having a little bit more production quality. Thanks so much. Bye.